Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, August 26th, 2019. I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria, and I'm time traveling a bit. I've actually recorded this in advance because I am currently traveling in Southern Africa and will be for the next several weeks. But don't worry, we have a new episode coming at you each week, even while I'm away. My social may be a little bit slow, but the podcast is still coming. This week, I want to thank those of you who made Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. And that's because of listeners just like you who have visited www.patreon.com/talknerdy. This week, I want to thank Dudas Infinitus, Phil T-Bear, The Zombie Drummer, David J.E. Smith, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell. If you want to hear your name called out at the top of the show, just visit my Patreon page and see what's what. You can also go to talknerdymerch.com and figure out other ways to support the show. All right, this week we have a great episode for you. I have a chance to talk to Anne Sverdrup-Thygeson. Now, that is not how you pronounce her name, but it is impossible for me to pronounce her name. She does it live on the show, so you're going to hear how you actually say her name, but she told me I could horribly bastardize it with my American accent. She is the author of Buzz, Sting, Bite: Why We Need Insects. She's also an ecologist and a fascinating person to chat with. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Anne Sverdrup-Thygeson. Well, Anne, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to talk about your new book, Buzz, Sting, Bite: Why We Need Insects. That's such a fun title. It's so punchy and to the point. Did you title it, or did you work with your publishers to come up with that?
No, actually, it's fun that you ask, because it was a suggestion from my publisher, and I actually opposed to it in the beginning because I thought it was too much on the negative. And I mean, my entire mission is to make people love insects. That's sort of this mission that the book is part of. And then it sounded strange to me to focus on all these negative things that insects do. But then again, it has this subtitle that makes it good again. My publisher convinced me that this would work with the US readership. So that's what it ended up with.
Was this written originally for a Norwegian readership and then you got a US publisher, or did you write it for the US market to begin with?
No, it was written in Norwegian, and it's my first book. And I didn't even think the thought that it was going to be translated to any languages. It wasn't in my head at all. And I had an agent asking me if he could take a manuscript to the London Book Fair last spring, or 2 years ago now, maybe. And before the book fair was over, the book was already sold to several countries. So it's now sold to 24 countries or territories, which is amazing.
That's amazing. Oh my gosh, that's incredible. And so what's the title in Norwegian?
Insektenes planet. Can you make out what that means?
Insektenes is that PLA?
Yeah.
Planet.
It's the same word.
Plummet?
Yeah.
Oh, insect plummet. So it's about the loss of... Planet. I heard plummet. Which is also a problem, right? But yes, planet of insects. Oh, I love that.
So yeah, actually in the UK, it's published sort of separately, and there is called Extraordinary Insects. So there are different titles in different countries, which is interesting.
Yeah, isn't it funny? It really goes to show how much our kind of social influences affect the way that we consume information and what we find appealing and what we don't.
Yeah.
So, Anne, you're an ecologist. You're a professor at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences and also a scientific advisor to the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. So you studied conservation biology. What your kind of main focus as an ecologist is maintenance, right, of the important species that helping to maintain the important species that maintain ecological balance.
Yes, I guess that's a nice way to sum it up. The importance of taking care of all these species that we depend on, and that sort of makes up the entire web of life on this planet.
And do you mostly focus on insects, or does your work have kind of a broad net?
I've been using insects, and it's more specifically insects living in dead trees as my model system for my research all through my career. So that's always been my main focus. But I'm teaching, for instance, nature conservation much more broadly than just insects. So I'm also dealing with, legal issues and effects of land use in general and climate change and so a wider context. And I work a lot with the thing that all these organisms that we share the planet with, they sort of give us all these goods and services, ecosystem services as they're called. Which we really haven't paid that much attention to until recently. We sort of think that we are independent of nature in a way. I mean, half of us live in cities, but still, this connection to nature is, of course, vital for our civilization and for our lives. So I try to bring that up and to show how that works. And especially this thing with insects, I think they deserve a lot more positive PR than they're getting, because they do all these nice things that we are completely dependent on, and people don't know that.
It's so true. I mean, I think you're right. We consider nature to be out there. And I think that is a fundamental problem with the way that we view nature. But also when it comes to insects, there's these other layers. They're very small. We don't notice them. When we do notice them, oftentimes people think of them as pests or invaders into their home, not realizing that insects, of course, are so fundamental and vital, and they thrive literally everywhere. And so when we build a house or we pave a road, we're building a house and paving a road right through their habitat.
Exactly. And I mean, this the way we use the land is really the main challenge for insects today. Because, of course, if you used to have a flower-rich meadow and then you turn it into a field with just one type of crop growing, and you dump tons of pesticides out there to keep that one crop growing. Of course, it's hard to be an insect out there. Most insects would not be able to live there then. So it's sort of very logical that insects are declining because we are putting a lot of pressure on this planet, and we are using land very intensively in many places.
So we talk about a decline in insect populations. And I think that, most people, probably at least the people who listen to my show, are probably well aware of the headlines that they see in science journalism day after day and week after week, where, a new study will come out to show a devastating decline in a specific species or a specific genus, or even a whole group of organisms. So the birds are dying, the oceans are dying. We're seeing population decimation in amphibians, for example, something like 30,000 times the background rate of extinction. We see other organisms that are thriving, like jellyfish or algal blooms, things like that. But I think most people are well aware of the fact that this sort of balance is threatened, likely due to climate change and deforestation and ocean acidification and all of these things that are inextricably linked. I'm not sure how much the headlines are coming through about insect populations. And so I was hoping maybe you could provide some clarity on how insects are doing right now, what the numbers look like, and, which ones are threatened, which ones are having that kind of opposite effect where we have too many, what's going on in the insect world.
Yeah. First of all, I mean, one point is that we don't really know because nobody has really cared to look very carefully into insects most of the time and most of the places. So we're really lacking long-term time series data on insect populations. So what we do have is a number of fairly recent studies from different local places in the world that show this dramatic decline. Decline in 75% drop in flying insects in Germany, up to 98% drop in certain types of insects in the forest of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. But it's hard to sort of fit together this global picture, except from the fact that I think all entomologists would agree that it is we are quite certain that insect populations in many places are changing. And like you're saying, it doesn't mean not necessarily that all insects are declining, but we have this process that is going on all over the planet where the common species are getting more common and more widespread, while all these species that were local, that were adapted to these specific conditions in one place or developed on an island, and that's the only place where they live. All these specialist species, they are declining and disappearing. Of course, some of the commons as well, but the generalists are becoming more and more widespread. So what we see is that the biodiversity, the species you see across different sites in geography, is becoming more and more similar. Which is a shame because, strange as it sounds, it's actually quite common to be rare if you are a species. Most species are rare. And what is happening now is that many of those rare species are really having a hard time, and we are ending up with a sort of a few, or those species that are already common and numerous, they are sort of gaining even more space, while all those others are having a hard time.
So when we think of common species, obviously it's different depending on, where in the world these discussions are being had, but there are some kind of standard common species that often, at least from a human perspective, I hate that, right? So often we talk about things from the perspective of like how they affect us. So we'll talk about species that are disease vectors like mosquitoes, or we'll talk about species that, or like ticks, for example, or species that we think of as quote unquote pests like cockroaches. But of course, these organisms really are around the planet. Like mosquitoes and cockroaches we find in like every single ecological niche, and they really are exploding, aren't they?
Yeah, there are. First of all, ticks are not insects. They are mites.
Thank you for that. And maybe we should take a step back. What is the difference? Like, how do we define an insect?
It's actually quite simple. The first thing you do is to count the legs. And if you can keep on counting after you've come to 6, then it's not an insect.
Okay.
Because insects have 6 legs. Whether they are cockroaches or beetles or flies or whatever, they have 6 legs. Of course, there are a few exceptions. Some have no legs, but they never have more than 6 legs.
So centipedes and millipedes and spiders are not insects.
Exactly. They are not insects. They are other sorts of arthropods or tiny creatures, but they're not insects. And then insects also have and usually 4 wings, except flies and mosquitoes that have 2 wings. But most of them have 4 wings. And then they are divided into 3 body parts. So this is sort of like a rhyme, like a children's rhyme. It's nothing on 5, but it's 6, 4, 3. And then on the front or the foremost body part, the head, you have 2 antennas. So, and then of course, especially in Norwegian, we write the word insect almost as you do in English, but a lot of people misspell it. So the 1 is for the fact that insect is written with 1 N.
I
So
love
there's
that.
my little rhyme. 6, 4, 3, 2, 1.
That's amazing. Oh my gosh. I'm always going to remember this now.
Yeah, hopefully that's the hope of it.
I love it. Okay, so sans mites, getting back to maybe mosquitoes and cockroaches.
Yeah. Yes.
These are the types of organisms that are really prevalent that, at least from a human perspective, oftentimes we think of as being problematic organisms, and they really are not. Well, maybe they are. I don't know. Are they in decline?
This is also interesting because we say cockroaches as they were one species. But actually, there are about as many species of cockroaches as there are species of mammals. The group we belong to.
Wow. Seriously?
Yes.
That's
Some
amazing.
5,000 species of cockroaches. And those that we think of as pests is like, okay, a handful or a couple of handfuls of those species. But the majority are species out in the wild doing their job as sort of janitors out in the forest or in a meadow or wherever they live, chewing up leaves, dead leaves and stuff like that, recycling dead plants and back to fertile soil again. So I always think it's interesting when people say, oh, we should get rid of all the cockroaches.
Yeah.
That is like saying we should get rid of all the mammals just because, you don't like rats. It's actually the same thing.
You're so right. And it's like when we think of mosquitoes as well, aren't we usually just talking about Anopheles? Like the one mosquito that carries malaria is the one that we really aren't a fan of.
That's often the one we speak about. There are a few more genuses that are sort of being a nuisance for us, but there again, there are lots of different kinds of mosquito-like creatures. I mean, thousands and thousands of them that do nothing wrong or are not bothersome at all. But I mean, just think about this tiny midge in the tropics that is more or less the only one that is capable of pollinating the cocoa flower, which is what gives us chocolate. That is quite fascinating. That is actually a sort of a mosquito that does that job. So,
wow.
Again, there are so much more than pest species. Pests are just a tiny, tiny, tiniest fraction of this incredibly rich and amazing and fascinating abundance of species.
So when we look at your book, the American edition, at least, Buzz, Sting, Bite, Why We Need Insects, which of course that subtitle is so fundamental to why you chose to write this book and to, in many ways, your life's work. And obviously that's a very big question to ask. It took a whole book to try to answer it. But I think in a way it's a good kind of jumping off point because, you mentioned mosquitoes that pollinate. You mentioned cockroaches that do this kind of quote unquote janitorial work. Does every single insect have an integral role in the ecological niche in which it survives? Are there any insects that kind of quote unquote don't do anything? Or is that just human hubris? Like we haven't figured out what they do yet?
Again, I guess it depends on exactly how you ask that question because yes, all insects do, all species on this planet do something. They have sort of a spot of their own or a place of their own in this huge web of nature. But then again, that doesn't mean that they are all, that every single species is completely necessary for continued life on Earth. I mean, probably quite a few species are redundant. But there's some issues about that. One thing is we don't know which ones.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty stupid to keep on, making species go extinct because we don't know which ones are not redundant. And then we're talking from a very egoistic sort of point of view because we're talking redundant as whether or not it hits back on us. So that's one thing about it. But also it's this thing that is happening now. It also is a sort of a moral issue because I think are we really comfortable with knowing that we are, sort of cutting branches of the evolutionary tree consciously, because that's what we're doing when we are making species go extinct, insects or whatever it is. We are sort of stopping that branch of evolution forever. And those species are gone. They will never come back. And all right, there are lots of species, and most species that have ever existed have already, gone extinct in this very, very long history of this planet. Still, I think we humans are taking up so much space on this planet. We are just one species. We share this planet with maybe 10 million other species. Shouldn't we just consider stepping back a little bit to make some room for all these other species, also just from a moral point of view, not only because they are useful for us? I think that's at least worth thinking about.
Absolutely. I mean, it's such a difficult, probably, proposition or uphill battle. It's so, I think, obvious and clear to people who do this work and to people who read these types of books and who spend a lot of time in nature, for example, or even, I shouldn't even say quote unquote in nature. How do we even define that? But spend a lot of time out of doors, in their own gardens, going on hikes, traveling, camping, because you do start to develop an appreciation. I remember when I visited the Peruvian Amazon, I was really struck by the fact that for the first maybe day or two, there were definitely sounds I was not familiar with. There would be certain birds or certain insect sounds that might wake me up in the middle of the night or that I would be, acutely aware of. But for the most part, I was at first surprised by how quote unquote dead the Amazon seemed to me. I was expecting it to be teeming with life. And I show up and I'm like, I don't see anything. And then day 2, day 3, I'm going on night hikes. I'm spending time with the naturalists. And I'm starting to notice that everywhere you look, it really is teeming with life. You see the leafcutter ants below your feet. At night, your headlamp shines on the forest floor and you see all of the little eyes of the spiders glinting back at you, and they're literally everywhere. And you become acutely aware of the smells and the sounds and even the touch of all of the organisms around you. But it takes so long, I think, and a little bit of training and a little bit of kind of meditative existing in order to even notice those things. And I say that because, as you said, it's almost such an obvious necessity for us to not just not do the things that are exterminating these organisms, but actively make changes to help protect their habitat. But the first step in that is noticing that they even exist.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I mean, you don't even need to go to the tropics to experience exactly what you're describing. I think you can go out in any sort of, a park with a few trees or something, or a forest in the US. And you can sit down and you can, look around you. If you find like a rotten log to sit on and you look around and try to count species, you probably wouldn't see that many. But then if you have the information, knowing that at least in the forest in the north of Europe, and it's probably not that different in the US, 1/3 of the species in the forest is actually living inside dead wood.
Wow.
So it's in that log that you're sitting on. That's where a lot of the life is, where a lot of the organisms are. And a lot more are in the soil underneath the sole of your shoes. So they are there, but they're sort of hidden, and you need to know that, and then you can start looking, and then you will see them, but still you won't see a whole lot because a lot of them are living tiny lives, maybe short life cycles. They're living inside this dead wood where you can't really see them unless you destroy the log. But I think I end my book with this quote by a Canadian entomologist, and I think it's such a good quote. It became sort of a motto for the entire book. And he said that the world is so rich in small wonders, but so poor in eyes that can see them. I think that is exactly what we're talking about now. We need to see, and those things we see and acknowledge and know something about. that's the things that we come to love, and the things we come to love we care about, and then we take care of it. And that's why I think I tried to make this book a fun book, a book of stories, a book of funny stories with fun facts and strange things you didn't know about insects, because I think in a way that love or passion is much stronger driving force to make people care about nature and the species out there than if I were to just write a book with all these scary things that are happening out there and telling all the readers that we can't do this and we shouldn't do this and we have to do less of that. I think instead, if people come to, if not love insects, at least appreciate them, and then they will get this sort of idea from themselves, or this, if it develops from inside, this urge to take care of insects, I think it's so much stronger. So that's my hope with the book.
Absolutely. It's such an important endeavor, I think, and it's exciting to see that in many ways, I think there is a probably not newfound, because I do think naturalism and especially entomology has like a long and rich history globally, but that there is kind of a, shall I say, trend, or even it's a little bit in fashion now for people in cities who I think are concerned about ecological preservation, who are concerned about climate change, to start to plant, for example, native plants in their gardens, understanding that they'll be providing habitat and a food source and a pollination source for the organisms that have always existed there. I'm glad to see that there is a trend in that direction. I hope that it only continues to grow. One of the things that I have to say that I'm really nervous about is the human capability to understand risk and to understand kind of like our statistical numeracy is really lacking in many ways. So I was wondering if maybe you could provide some clarity about the forces, quote unquote, that are threatening to insects in our kind of current global experience. So, for example, we often talk about climate change, but we don't really understand, is it, factory farming? Is it monocropping? Is it air travel? Is it automobile travel? Like, what are the contributing factors that are most making a dent? What kinds of things can we do, both as citizens, like individual people, but also sort of more on a governmental scale, a civic duty kind of scale, to try and mitigate or reverse some of those changes? Like, what is it that actually is affecting these insect populations, and kind of what is more dire and what is maybe not as dire? Are we focusing on the right things, for example?
Yeah, I mean, the main factors that are creating problems for insects would be, the main factor would be the land use, and this intensive land use, the fact that we have changed so much of the natural vegetation, both meadow type vegetation and forests and all sorts of different ecosystems, into something much more monoculture like. I mean, even the forests are industrialized. We are trying to get as much fiber out of them as possible. So the trees are not allowed to grow old in a biological sense. So the land use is the main thing, but then of course both climate change, pesticides and insecticides of different kinds, and pollution, and introduced species comes on top of that and makes it more difficult. And I think there are several things that we can do and that we should do that works on different levels. As individuals, I think I agree with you. I think it's really nice that people try to do nice things for insects, that they have these insect hotels. You probably have them in the US as well, where you put up in the garden, and that you think about what sort of flowers you have, and you try to make, pollen and nectar-rich plants that grow through the entire summer season. So these things are really good. Also because it leads to, engagement, and I think that is really important. And I have this one idea that I think that would have a huge impact if everybody could sort of help out in this very easy way with becoming, joining the cheerleading team for insects. Because just the way we talk about insects has a lot of impact. Like we started saying, if you only talk about insects as pest species, why should we care about taking care of them then, conserve them? But if we are good at telling our kids or our neighbors or our colleagues at work that insects are doing fabulous things for us, that we actually need them, that they are janitors, they are pollinators, they are food for our freshwater fish, for our salmon, for our birds. They inspire us with all these amazing ideas. They give us these products that you had no idea that came from insects. If we, give them credit for all the good things, I think that would have a huge impact, because I think hopefully that would then lead to people thinking differently about how we should live in connection, or in when it comes to nature and what we do to nature. And that will hopefully again affect how people vote, how people get engaged in NGOs of different kinds, all these larger things that we also need to do. I mean, we need to work on different levels, both the personal level and the political level, to make this, move in the right direction.
All right, guys, let's get back to the show. Do you think that there are things that we can be doing in the media to help bring this? Obviously, your book is a good example of a type of media that brings this information to a non-expert consumer, for example. So your book is a popular science book. It's not a trade book, or it is a trade book. It's not an academic book. And so, people are going to pick this up because they see it at a bookstore. But there's also something about sort of having a built-in audience, right? People who are already browsing the science section, people who, see the reference to insects and say, that already interests me and maybe I want to read about it. Hopefully people hear about it on a press list, or they, for example, right now hear about it on a podcast and they go, gosh, I didn't know I was interested, but now I do. But obviously in a broader media, television, film, things of that nature, we're not doing a very good job of making this relevant to people at all, are we?
No, I guess, you have people like David Attenborough and his films, his movies or series that has had a huge impact on people's interest of nature. So there are some decent exceptions, but all in all, I think most of the focus is on a few big animals we have a close relationship to. I would say, if people ask me who's the audience for my book, I often say that it is for anybody who has ever encountered an insect.
I love that.
Yeah, because that's my hope. It's a book for all those that don't care about insects, or don't know that they care about insects, all those that hate insects, and those that love them. But for all those people that are non-academics, not really interested in insects in the beginning, because I think once you start to hear or to read these stories about all the interconnections between the life of insects and our lives, you realize both that there are a lot of fun stories here, things that you didn't know that are actually laughable and bizarre and strange. And there are also so many connections with different topics. Medicine research or medical research, architecture, design, popular science, or popular culture. I mean, anything. I write about Beyonce, and her pop songs. I write about ancient Egyptian history, Chinese, the Silk Road in China, buildings, these houses that they build in Africa that were built after a model of a termite hill that only use a fraction of the energy consumption of a normal building. Thought that we can look to ants to find new antibiotics, or fruit flies that have actually earned 6 Nobel Prizes in medicine. There's so many things that tie us in with the insect world that people are not aware of. And the reaction I get from people that read, or people I talked about insects, is that, wow, I didn't know that, insects are in so many ways tied to our lives, much more intimately integrated in our lives than we are aware of. So I think it's fun to tell stories, and I've spent a lot of time, trying to find parallels or metaphors, like the janitor metaphor, that will make it easy to understand these, how these insects, how they live their lives, and why they are so important and fun.
I think it's such an important point that you make about storytelling. And it's something that kind of in the world of science communication, we discuss quite often, people who work as professional science communicators, people who do outreach for organizations like museums. More and more, we're starting to understand, even from an academic level and a social psychology level, how important it is to tell stories, to capture the imagination of individuals and really draw them in. I'm interested to know, as an ecologist and a professor, an academic, how did you come to understand that? Was it an evolution of your work? Have you studied science communication separately? Where did you find that path, and how do you do it so well?
Well, thanks. I've always been interested in language, actually. I used to, collect words when I
Oh
was
my
a kid.
gosh, that's so sweet.
These yes, it's sort of fun to think back on. I used to have this, like, the word. I don't know if I pronounce it correct in English though, but onomatopoeticon. The word for sound mimicking
Yes.
words. How do you say
Yes.
it
So
in English?
we say onomatopoeia.
Okay, yeah, that's it. So that
Yeah.
was one of my favorite words. I thought that was such a wonderful word. I was like 6 years old. So that's, I think I've always sort of had that interest. And I actually started studying not biology or ecology, but history. And then I went on, I studied at the University of Georgia for a year. And then I studied journalism and
Mm.
mass communication. So I thought I would go that way, but then I came back to Norway, and I sort of, actually, I think I was out in nature, and I had this just sort of strong experience that made me realize that I could actually turn studying nature into a job. You could actually, somebody would pay you to study nature and to work with that. So I switched to biology. And then for a long time, I wrote just these boring scientific papers, sort of dry stuff. I think I always had this urge of using another language. And 4 or 5 years ago now, I started a science blog, where I wrote, together with a few colleagues, I wrote fun stories about insects.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really where it all started. Because then I realized that this works. I got a lot of interest from the Norwegian media. And, things started to roll. I was asked to come on the radio and television. And then all of a sudden, this publisher asked me to write a book. And there I am.
That's so cool. And so are you still working on your blog? Do you still maintain it?
Yes, but I must admit that I'm writing less on it now that there are so many other outlets and so many other things that take my
Mm-hmm.
time. But we do still keep it, and we try we sort of, usually I used to write the majority, I think, of the blogs. And now we have more of a schedule. So now we have 4 people, a colleague of mine and 2 of my previous PhD and my present PhD. So and we have like every second week, and then it doesn't become all that often. So it still works, and it's fun. It's a very nice way to find the way of playing the language and reaching another audience as a scientist.
Oh, absolutely. Do you find at the university where you work, is it relatively progressive in terms of the support for public outreach of science? Like, do undergraduates or graduate students seek you out because of the outreach that you do? I think a lot of times in the US, it's getting better, but oftentimes I hear stories of students experiencing a lot of pushback from their professors for doing public communication of science.
Oh,
And
really?
whether it be like, oh, we don't promote our work, we don't self-promote, or even something as kind of quote unquote simple, but I think in some ways more difficult, kind of like, you shouldn't prioritize this, get back to the lab, I think is also a common refrain. Do you feel like things are a little bit different in that way in Norway, or maybe at your university?
I think it's both.
Mm.
You do have those really super ambitious, pushing, the research frontier type of environments here as well.
Mm.
And I think the, I mean, like the investment in research, the government is really interested in that. Also in Norway, that we should be there, at the research frontier.
Yeah.
But I also think that there is an increasing understanding of the importance of scientists not sitting, in the place of their own, far away, sort of detached from society, doing their sciencey stuff,
Yeah.
while everybody else is out there having no idea what they're doing. And I mean, suppose if we are doing important stuff, then of course we need to get out there and tell the rest of the society about what we're doing and why we do it. And I must admit that at my university, I've experienced pretty much only positive feedback on my work. Of course, I still have to do all the other things that I should do. I do the teaching and the research as well, so it's tricky with time sometimes. But I mean, my superiors have really been very supportive, I think, and I appreciate that a lot. That is important. Because it does take time, of course. And I'm lucky because I'm a professor, so I'm at the point of my career where I've come so far that I can spend time on this. Of course, in an early career, I read the book Lab
Yeah.
Girl by Andrew Karen. It seems to be even more competitive to become, maybe especially a female scientist in the US than at least my experience as a Norwegian scientist.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's difficult because there's all the different streams that individuals are working sometimes with and sometimes against, and whether they have to do with privilege, whether they have to do with being a woman of color, trying to break in, especially. Are you a biologist? Are you a physicist? Are you a computer scientist? Where there's even more kind of entrenched misogyny or privilege, it's like all those things combined. And then on top of it, I think sometimes it's just a fear around being really brutally honest or sharing your experience and kind of finding that balance between saying, I want to do this because I want to help open doors for other individuals. But at the same time, I don't want to offend or embarrass or, do anything that could threaten my own academic career. And it's that fine line that so many people are walking. But I mean, as a whole, you're so right. I mean, what is the point of doing academic research if the individuals who are ultimately downstream going to benefit from it don't even understand that it's being done, and can't comprehend it? Like, if it still feels esoteric to them, how are they ever going to vote for the funding that's required to keep it going, for example? Integral.
Exactly.
Gosh, I didn't even expect us to go down that rabbit hole, but it's such an important one, I think, to go down. This is like asking you about your favorite children, but which insects do you find yourself most gravitated towards? Which ones have you spent the bulk of your career really focusing on?
That would be beetles, which is a big group. It's the group that we know the most species in. It's probably not that if we knew all the species, then it probably would be Hymenopterus instead, or even the flies, the dipterans. But beetles, that is a large group. But it's especially these wood-living beetles that I've been working with, and I think they're really fascinating. They live these hidden lives again. And one of the things that we've been researching a lot these last years, together with my PhDs and my colleagues, is that the fact that beetles and fungi, they interact in ways that we haven't really been aware of, sort of, or vaguely similar to plants and insects. Insects taking pollen from the plants, pollinating them, or insects dispersing the seeds of plants, like a lot of ants do. And we've actually found that this network between wood-living beetles and wood-living fungi is of a similar strength as these seed dispersal networks between insects and plants. So some fungi can actually hitchhike with insects, with beetles. They can hitchhike either on the surface, probably, or in the guts. Then they come, when the beetle then fly away, the beetle has, directional flight. It can fly straight to a new, recently dead tree, while this poor fungi is dependent on all the spores that are just sort of poured out into the air, that just flies on the airstreams. But if the spores of the fungi can instead hitchhike with a beetle, the fungi will be brought straight to the place that it wants to be, a newly dead tree. And it can come there early, because if it hitchhikes with the right beetle, it can come there before all competitors has invaded this log. And for the insect, for the beetle as well, it's an advantage to bring along fungi. Some insects do that, regularly, because some fungi, or wood-living fungi, for instance, break down some of the structures in the dead wood that the insects can't do themselves. So it actually becomes more easy to get access to the nutrients in the wood if fungi has already been there. So I think this association, this interconnection between beetles and fungi, is really, really interesting, and it's a completely new field that is opening up. We're using a lot of DNA techniques, of course, which is giving us sort of a window into these dead logs where we can't really see, but still, using new techniques, we can understand much more of it than we used to.
Oh, it's so fascinating how you really can dedicate your life's work to something that I think ostensibly is such a tiny little environment. But of course, as you know from the work that you've done, there really is a massive vastness and a huge impact that that this kind of life cycle, this integrated cycle has. I'm reminded of some of the news stories that I've read recently about the rich life that teems within an elephant's footprint.
Yeah. Yeah.
That there's like a whole ecosystem there within this vestige of where an elephant stepped. And it's just so cool to think about the fact that this happens all over the planet every second of every day, that one organism, makes one decision, makes one action, and so many other things are affected, and there's so many downstream effects from it. And it really is this beautiful symphony, this beautiful dance. And then, of course, the shadow is cast over over this realization when you start to think about the decisions that we as a human species have been making for hundreds of years, and all of the downstream effects that come from that. And only recently, and only within certain populations, I shouldn't say only recently, because I think that actually is unfair to a lot of indigenous groups who have been thinking about this for thousands of years. So maybe I should say only recently in the West, and only within certain populations, have we really started to think about the fact that we need to build in mitigation, and we need to build in downstream effects to our models when we're making these kinds of, industrial decisions. It really is heartbreaking, honestly.
Yes, and I think it's. I don't know if you're aware of this. You have the climate panel in the UN, the
Mm-hmm.
IPCC, but you also have this sister organization, the IPBS, which is a similar panel for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And they just brought out this report in May this year on how the world is faring when it comes to biodiversity and ecosystem services. And of course, it's tired reading, and they are so clear though that we really have to change, because we have to change fundamentally if this is gonna be all right, because now we are making such a huge footprint on the planet. That doesn't have to do with insects, but it's such a strong metaphor or picture. So it's nice to tell it anyway. If you look at the world's mammals, the terrestrial mammals of the world, and you weigh them, you know that 96% of that weight will be us humans and our farm animals. And only
Oh my
4%
gosh.
of this biomass of all terrestrial mammals are the wild mammals. And that is quite something to think about.
Oh,
And
it's
I think
horrifying.
yes, it is. But it illustrates, because sometimes, people think that, oh, everybody's complaining about this. But it's still looking fine. But when you hear stuff like that, you can realize that that's not gonna work in the long run, because of course that has a huge impact on everything, and it's gonna. The thing now is that we are changing. Of course, nature is resilient in many ways. Nature is dynamic, and nature is adapting. I mean, evolution is still going on, of course. But the scary thing for me right now is that we humans are changing things too rapidly, and we're changing too many things at the same time. Like we're saying, land use, climate change, pesticides, introduced alien species. So it's really a question of whether nature is capable of following the speed, if they're able to come along on this and adapt quickly enough. And that's why we really need to, like this IPBS, the UN report is saying very clearly, we need to really change fundamentally the way we construct our societies and the way we are living, and step down a bit on our consumption and our footprints on the planet.
Oh, absolutely. It's and the first step, of course, is understanding that. It's learning that, so that we can be armed with the information that we need to be able to make those kinds of those changes, to be able to think about those things. And I think books like yours are so important for bringing that information to people who maybe wouldn't even be aware of what's happening kind of beneath their feet and within these rotten logs, and just throughout the planet. And I always close my show by asking my guests the same two questions, because it's always so fascinating to me. I interview obviously a lot of scientists and a lot of authors on my show, and it's always interesting to me to see what's kind of at the forefront of people's minds. I don't want to spoil it by saying I could maybe guess what your answers are going to be. So instead, I'm just going to open up these questions to you. They're quite big picture questions. So here we go. The first one is, when you think about the future, in whatever context is relevant to you right now. So obviously, it could be the future of the globe, of the universe. It could be the future of you and your work, your family, your legacy, however you want to contextualize the future. The first thing I want to know is, what is the thing that does keep you up the most at night, that you're most worried about, concerned about, maybe even, bordering on cynical about? And then on the flip side of that, so we end on a bit of a positive note, what are you genuinely optimistic about? What are you actually really, honestly looking forward to?
I think for the first part of your question, I think what keeps me up at night, or what keeps me what can get me down on a bad day, so to say, is really this challenge of making people understand in time, and making people understand that it doesn't have to be, bad to change the way we live necessarily. I mean, there are many good things as well about changing your lifestyle with there are health effects of eating less meat, for instance. There are definitely health effects of driving less in your car or flying less. Maybe changing your holiday pattern to spending more time in nature around where you're living. So making people care enough, and motivating them to change this, trying to find out how are we going to do this in time to turn around while there is still hope, because I think it's not like we are expecting this Hollywood style Armageddon type catastrophe tomorrow, day after tomorrow. But I think it's really sad if we are not changing in time. Like I was saying, it will be much less nice to be humans on this planet. Why would we want to do that when we can change? If all of us change a little, it will go a long way. So that's what frustrates me. How can we sort of make people understand, push the right buttons? And then on the flip side, I think what still gives me hope is, I think I would say that the result I've seen from my book, and from the talks I do with people, the fact that I think it is possible to get people hooked on these things through passion and enthusiasm and storytelling, and using humor, and nice stories to make people realize all the wonderful things out there, and then sort of just hinting at this fact that we could lose all of this if we are not changing. And I think that works. That's why I think my book has been sold to 24 countries, and that's why it has been a Sunday Times bestseller in the UK and in Sweden and in Norway, because there is something there that people can hook into. I think people feel this. There is a little seed inside all of us with feeling this love of nature, where we can water and make grow, and hopefully make more people see all these small wonders that are all around us in nature, right underneath our noses, even though we are not so aware of it.
Absolutely. And this was such an inspiring conversation. As much as I think that we can become a little bit overwhelmed with the like kind of hugeness, the vastness of the problem, I think it's also really exciting to know that there are people like yourself who are actively working on these things, studying these things, and sharing these stories and having these conversations. Because I think once we all become more aware of what's happening, it becomes an obvious decision to do what we can to mitigate and even start to maybe try, if we can, to reverse some of this damage that we have collectively caused as a society. But like we said, that the first step to that is really understanding it. And I'm so glad that you're doing the work that you're doing, and sharing this with all of us. So thank you so much for being here. I've learned an awful lot.
Thanks a lot for asking me to join the show. It's been a pleasure to talk about these things.
Absolutely. Guys, in the American edition, the book is called Buzz, Sting, Bite, Why We Need Insects. And I'm going to let Anne pronounce her name once again, the author, because I absolutely butchered it at the top of the show. Can you pronounce your name for us one more time?
Yeah, if I were to say it in Norwegian, I would say Anne Sverdrup-Thygeson.
It's so beautiful. I love it. It's so beautiful. Well, again, thank you so much for being here. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.